Good morning. We have the pleasure of welcoming Olli Rehn to another Lectures of the Governor series. Olli is one of the most influential, not only governors of central banks in Europe, but also in the last 10, 15 years, Olli was one of the most influential policymakers in Europe, in particular during the sovereign debt crisis. So we are delighted to bring Olli Rehn to be here at the OECD to discuss some topics I think that are absolutely crucial, not only for Finland, but also for the rest of Europe. So we look forward for the discussion. I should say that Olli has served as Vice President of the European Commission between, as I said, 2011 and 2014. And also as a member of the European Commission, he was responsible for the enlargement between 2004 and 2010, and for economic and monetary affairs between 2010 and 2014. So Olli Rehn was basically during at the height of the financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. He was one of the most instrumental people in Europe. I know it from personal experience as well, because I was in government in Portugal. And when we had to talk with the Commission, exactly with Olli, that kept us on our toes, and but always with a very, not only a friendly face, but also a very constructive attitude. And his thought has been one of the most, I think, influential, as I said, in the European Union in the last 2 decades. So we are delighted to have him here. Before he served in the Commission, he was Minister of Economic Affairs and has been a member of the Finnish and European Parliament as well. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, but also is a professor at Political Science at the University of Helsinki. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Olli Rehn to this Governor's Lectures of the Governor. Looking forward to hear you, Olli.
Thank you, Alvaro, for your very kind words of introduction, which brings many mostly positive memories, and I'm very happy that in the past couple of years, Portugal, Spain, Greece, as well as Ireland have been one of the best performers in Europe in terms of economic development. So the reforms and stability that was restored 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is paying off. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to contribute to the, I understand, fairly recently launched OECD lecture series by central bank governors. That said, I usually try to steer clear of full-blown lecturing. So I look forward to a lively dialogue following my opening remarks. It's a real pleasure to be back at the OECD. I've always held the organization in high regard, especially for its high-quality, rigorous work on structural reforms and evidence-based policy analysis. Before the subject at hand, allow me first a personal recollection. Back in the early 1990s, when I was an even younger man than today, I chaired the Finnish delegation to the Council of Europe, and I very deliberately wanted to become a member of the Council's Economic Committee, because I knew that it is responsible for the parliamentary oversight of the OECD with members of parliament from other OECD countries. We met a few times a year in these premises, and whenever the meeting was over, I would head straight to the basement, to the OECD basement bookstore, which I gather no more exists. That was my trusted source of fresh reading material, valuable analytical raw material to use for my doctoral thesis. This was the pre-internet era when research still meant browsing real books and statistics, not just typing a search bar or prompting ChatGPT. So yes, I owe the OECD a sincere and warm thank you for its indirect but invaluable contribution to my DPhil thesis on corporatism and industrial competitiveness in small European states. You may say a rather niche topic, perhaps, but surprisingly still relevant today. I can tell you that I had déjà vu many times when reading the Draghi report on European industrial competitiveness. Of course, the usual disclaimer applies. The OECD bears no responsibility for any shortcomings of my doctoral thesis, if indeed any are ever discovered. So returning to today's subject, I shall speak about Europe's triple test, i.e. 3 Ds or 3 major tests facing Europe: defense, decarbonisation and dynamism. I'll start with the euro area short-term outlook and monetary policy before addressing the longer-term strategic structural challenges that Europe and many OECD countries now face. And for the more globally minded, please forgive me if I have a particular European streak in my talk. There's a good reason for this. Going some way back, I wrote my first longer article on the euro in 1992, titled The General Theory of Employment, Money and Integration. No lack of self-confidence by a young chap, boldly paraphrasing John Maynard Keynes, as you may note. At that time, when the Maastricht Treaty had not yet been signed and Finland not even a member of the European Community, hardly could I imagine that the euro would take center stage of my life. But I can say no regrets, as building Europe continues to be a most meaningful and constantly evolving project. We are living through a profound geopolitical shift, concretely felt in Russia's illegal, brutal war in Ukraine and in the tragic conflict in the Middle East, which took yet another new turn last night following Israel's airstrikes on Iran's infrastructure and Iran's retaliation. The post-war rules-based international order is under heavy pressure from authoritarian power politics. Leaders like Xi, Putin and Trump are each in their own way pushing for a world where might is the only right. A tripolar order dominated by great power, rivalry and spheres of influence is unlikely to bring peace or prosperity, which may be the understatement of the week. The US is reassessing its global role with a widening strategic distance from Europe. While some hope for a return to the old normal, there are, in my view, few signs of that, which means Europe must face reality and take far greater responsibility for its own security as the European pillar of NATO. At the same time, US economic thinking has shifted, protectionism has returned, and the US risks undermining its greatest advantage its global talent pipeline. Actions against universities and immigration may hurt the country's long-term growth even more than tariffs. Europe is getting ready to fill the void once we move boldly to attract talent, invest in innovation, and close the competence gap, as highlighted in the Draghi report last September. And international cooperation remains essential despite all the headwinds. I believe few things unite economists more than our support for free trade. Europe must defend and deepen its network of trade agreements, particularly with the global south, the emerging and developing countries. Concerning Europe's economy and its outlook, the conditions remain favorable for a strengthening of euro area growth despite tariffs and threats of tariffs. Here we have a figure or slide from the latest ECB, or actually Eurosystem, broad macroeconomic projection exercise from published last week. And we see that growth is forecasted for this year to be a little bit below 1%, 0.9%, and slightly above 1 next year, 1.1, and 1.3 in 2027. In particular, strong real rates and employment developments and the easing of financing conditions due to or thanks to lower interest rates support a gradual strengthening of growth. The positive growth impact of higher defense spending will also partly offset the adverse impact of tariffs. Inflation in the euro area has declined to 1.9%. That's the latest figure for headline inflation, with core inflation neutralized from energy and food prices at 2.3%. Service prices and wages have moderated roughly as expected, and energy prices have been easing since last year, at least until last night. Overall, inflation has stabilized at around our 2% medium-term inflation target. Of course, trade tensions complicate the picture. To illustrate the uncertainty surrounding tariffs, the ECB published alternative scenarios in the context of last week's forecast. And they can be consulted at our website. The scenarios show that inflation risks are clearly tilted to the downside. However, these scenarios do not describe or take into account all possible channels. For instance, serious disruptions concerning supply chains with geoeconomic fragmentation, or serious disruptions to financial markets are not factored in these scenarios. Given this context, we decided at the ECB Governing Council last week to cut policy rates the 8th time since last June. Before our meeting, President Trump, who has put quite some pressure on Chair Jay Powell, said that the ECB has already cut 9 times, cut rates 9 times. I have to correct that. We had cut 7 times by then. Now we have been cutting 8 times since last June. With uncertainty ahead we don't, in the current conditions, practice rate forward guidance like we did when we were closer to the zero lower bound or effective lower bound. Instead, we retain full freedom of action, full optionality, lean on data dependency, and take decisions meeting by meeting. Overall, if you look at the last couple of years, last half decade, the recent inflation shock has taught us valuable lessons, especially the paramount importance of central bank independence, which has been rock solid and evolving in Europe, in the US, and many other countries since the Volcker shock of the 1980s. And another important lesson has been the importance of inflation expectations, the paramount importance of inflation expectations. These lessons will be summarized in the results of our ongoing strategy review, which we are currently working on, and its results will be published in the third quarter of this year. To give you a broader context for the ECB strategy review, let's take a look at the short history of inflation in the euro area over the last quarter of century, which is the period the euro has existed. I have divided the euro era into 3.5 distinct periods. Still half a year I would have said 3 periods, now I say 3.5 distinct periods. Let me explain. First, in the final years of the Great Moderation from 1999 to 2009, inflation in the euro area averaged around 2%. I recall ECB President Jean-Claude Trichet slightly bragging at the time before the financial crisis that average inflation in the euro area had been by then 1.97. Can you get closer to the then definition of price stability, which was defined as below but close to 2%? 1.97 is pretty close to below but close to 2%. The second era is the post-financial crisis period until around 2020-21, when inflation was exceptionally low, too low, averaging just above 1%, when we had at least 2 periods when we flirted with a real danger of deflation, which, as you know, is poison to sustainable growth and high employment. And then the third period in 2021-23, when inflation surged and averaged over 5%, with a peak 10.6% in October 2022. The point is that each of these periods point from the point of view of macroeconomics and monetary economics is that each of these periods was characterized by different drivers of inflation or deflation or disinflation, if you prefer that word. When we at the ECB Governing Council last reviewed our monetary policy strategy in July 2021, that is 4 years ago, we had indeed suffered nearly a decade of too low inflation. And then we decided to revise our inflation target. And I dare to say that, for instance, the research done by the Bank of Finland was useful, instrumental in that regard. Our economists studied in the second half of the 2010s the inflation developments in Europe, and they proved that the previous inflation target below but close to 2% was by market forces and the general public perceived as a ceiling. And because it was perceived as a ceiling, it had a downward bias, and the real inflation target was actually clearly below that 2%, somewhere in the scale of 1.6, 1.8%, which contributed to the too long period of excessively low inflation. When we talked about, and with due respect to my all Japanese friends, whom I have many, we talked about Japanification in those days. And this new inflation target is symmetric and medium term. So we opted for a symmetric inflation target of 2%, where both deviations from the target are undesirable to both directions, upwards and downwards. And we focus on the medium term, so we don't have to do sudden, abrupt moves. We can look through if we think that it is, for instance, a supply shock. And in my view, this inflation target has indeed served us well through the multi-crisis years and through different operating environments from the standpoint of price stability. So when deciding that, we were, without knowing it then, I recall the meeting on the 8th of July 2021. Without knowing it, we were on the brink of a period of dramatically accelerating inflation. I remember some discussions in the early summer of 2021 when some commentators said that Europe will never get rid of its Japanification, even if you revise your target. Well, we may have been in the target of 2% during 2021 for some, let's say, 1 week or 1 month before inflation surged and galloped very high. After the surge of inflation and its peak at 10.5%, euro area inflation was brought back down to the vicinity of the target thanks to the ECB tightening monetary policy and to lower energy prices. So today we are in the 4th period, now roughly halfway through. And as said, we have been on an easing cycle since last June. For now, looking at headline inflation, yes, we are in a good place. Inflation has returned to around 2%, which is our medium-term target, as I said. However, as all the friends of Europe's national sport know, in a football game, the most dangerous half-time scoreline is 2-0. That's when complacency creeps in and suddenly the game can take a drastic turn. And dear friends, we face the same risk in monetary policy now. Therefore, we must stay vigilant and monitor risks of deflation, de-anchoring to both directions. As inflation is projected to stay below 2% in the course of the whole year, next year, 26, we must be mindful of not slipping towards the zero lower bound again, as happened in the 2010s, in the previous decade. Especially, we must focus on keeping the inflation expectations firmly anchored to the 2% target. And that's why Team ECB will remain alert and will be ready to act with agility, actively, and determination as and if needed. Concerning Europe's structural challenges, I will give you a snapshot on 3 issues which I mentioned in the beginning. And common defense is the first one of them. It's clear that Europe has to take greater responsibility for its own defense. In the short term, the best way to strengthen security in the European continent is to support Ukraine. At the same time, national and common European projects need to be launched to strengthen the EU's own common defence capability. Additional national defence spending remains essential, especially since many European countries still fall short of NATO obligations, which are, by the way, likely to be tightened at the upcoming NATO summit. But at the same time, it's important to note that Europe's external security is a European public good. It can be improved most effectively with concrete common European solutions and joint procurement, not just by spending more. And if new spending is directed at developing the European defence industry and equipment, it will lead to broader economic benefits. And this brings us to common European financing. Joint defence solutions require joint financing. If common debt is opted for, it must be used effectively and efficiently for European public goods and backed by common future revenue. The EU budget can in principle, and I hope also in practice, be reshaped accordingly, and efforts can be made to increase the EU's own resources related to the EU budget. However, such changes require unanimity from member states, which is far from easy to achieve, and that's why we need pragmatic creativity. In this context, ideas like Bruegel's think tank Bruegel's proposal for a European defence mechanism or for an EU defence development bank by a group of member states are worth serious consideration. It would be a coalition of the willing and able, with participating states providing capital and managing common projects. Based on the template of the European Stability Mechanism, which Alvaro and myself were creating 10-15 years ago. It started as a fully capitalized institution in 2013, based on the 2010 template of the European Financial Stability Mechanism Facility. This model could enable rapid progress and allow non-EU countries like the United Kingdom, Norway, Canada, Ukraine to join as equal members. What about trade policy in the geopolitical context? As we know, protectionism is back, and we've done some scenarios for small open economies like Finland, and indeed most EU and OECD member states. The damage of tariff wars would be very serious. They benefit no one. The European Union has responded calmly but firmly, proposing tariff reductions net zero in this context, preparing proportionate countermeasures and defending our economic interests. But it is also important to continue to expand other trade partnerships. Europe is deepening its trade ties globally, especially with emerging and developing economies. And the European Union already has free trade agreements with over 70 countries, covering nearly half of its external trade. Agreements on negotiations with Australia, India and Indonesia, for instance, are in progress. In my view, the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement should be ratified without delay. The Latin American democracies are natural partners for Europe, and trade agreements are now as much about geopolitics as economics. Green transition is not a luxury. It is, at least for Europe, it is the only viable energy strategy. Unlike the US, we lack cheap domestic fossil fuels. That's why the path to energy security lies in renewables, clean tech and efficiency, and idea to add nuclear power. As Draghi put it, decarbonisation is a chance for Europe to lead in clean tech and secure low-cost energy. And it's not putting brakes on growth. Empirical experience shows that we can reduce emissions and grow at the same time. Developments over the past decades, such as the decoupling of economic growth and CO2 emissions, show that the green transition and economic growth are not mutually exclusive goals. Yes, there are short-term costs, stranded assets and adaptation, but long-term productivity gains are real. More resource-efficient systems, new markets and stronger energy independence. Dynamism is another challenge. The third challenge, Europe's productivity growth has lagged behind that of the US. Investment in common defense and the green transition offer a chance to revitalize productivity growth, but only if we do the right things. Europe, unlike the US, lacks deep capital markets and a unified innovation system. And that's why intensifying the work for a European safe and liquid asset and deeper and liquid capital markets is so important. Europe is today underperforming in channeling savings to investment. There are currently estimated to be about 10 trillion euros in bank accounts, which is a vast potential to be even partly mobilized more productively for equity investment, offering higher return for European investors. And safe assets are critical in attracting investment and the backbone of monetary power. The EU's reform momentum for the savings and investment union should now be accelerated by setting a clear, ambitious timeline for its completion, such as 1st of January 2028, as my friend and colleague Governor François Villeroy of the Bank of France has suggested. And above all, Europe must rediscover its traditional strength, talented people. We have top universities, skilled workers, a history of academic freedom, and the US has relied heavily on imported talent, especially in technologies. If that inflow weakens, Europe must be ready to lead again. But talent won't come by accident. We need sound immigration policy, investment in education, and a culture that values research and risk-taking. Human capital is indeed the foundation of long-term growth. Dear friends, let me conclude with a reflection on how Europe builds resilience, not just through policy or institutions, but through its modus operandi, if not modus vivendi. The European Union has always evolved by solving practical problems together, step by step. And this is the essence of the community method, what the great scholar David Mitrany called functionalism. Form follows function, and where cooperation in one area is creating spillovers that drive integration in other areas, economic, security, political and human. The EU's first and foremost funding personality, Jean Monnet, understood this deeply when he said, Europe will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. Whether in coal and steel, in the single market, in the euro, or now in defense, the green transition and capital markets, Europe has advanced not only by a brilliant blueprint, but by acting concretely and staying the course, by confronting challenges together and finding shared solutions. And this logic remains as relevant today as ever when we reinforce Europe's common defense, accelerate the green transition, and invest in industrial competitiveness. We are not just fixing separate problems. Instead, we are essentially reinforcing the fabric of Europe. And that's how, dear friends, Europe turns pressure into progress and pragmatism into purpose. And if Europe succeeds in this now, it will benefit the whole world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Governor Rehn. So first of all, thanks for your very strategic view of Europe. I think that's highly appreciated. I think Olli was mentioning something that is, I think, quite striking, which is sometimes we forget how important, how successful the euro has been. I'm reading a fantastic, really interesting book by Kenneth Rogoff, one of the big economists, as you know, in the world, most influential ones, called Our Dollar, Your Problem. But he has a chapter exactly about Europe in which he says, well, listen, 20 years ago, nobody believed that the euro, in the most influential economists in America did not believe that the euro would be able to be successful. And in fact, it was. And in fact, you have more and more countries coming in. And certainly the euro has established itself as one of the unequivocal successes of Europe. Having said that, we'll open the door for we'll open now for the question Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please either we have about 100 people online, so raise your virtual flag. Otherwise, people just raise your hand here. But I can start if that's okay. Why is Europe so good at producing great reports, but not really great at implementing them? So we have the Draghi, we have the letter report. But remember, with the Lisbon Treaty, was always the ambition that Europe would be the most competitive region in the world by 2020. And at this pace, not even by 2050, if so. Because basically, if you look what happens in terms of diffusion of AI, in fact, we just produced a report for the G7 that shows that Europe's diffusion of AI is slower, the exposure to AI is slower, and the productivity impact is going to be much slower in the European countries than other countries. Than, say, the United States. So, what's going on? So why is Europe so good at in the blueprints, but then we don't implement them?
Thank you, Alvaro, for a very pertinent question, which is critical for Europe's future development. First, I want to say that when we talk about the euro and, for instance, the eurozone debt crisis, I recall often the market participants, the market forces were predicting the collapse or breakup of the euro. Maybe starting with Greece, Brexit, or at some point even speculating that Finland would be leaving. I remember one event in New York when some of the younger market forces cornered me and asked me if Finland will be leaving the euro already next week or only during the coming fall of 2012. So I have to say that often market participants underestimate the strong political commitment to the euro over the euro member states and the European Central Bank, which was outlined in the summer of 2012 when President Mario Draghi of the ECB expressed his famous words that we will do whatever it takes within our mandate to save the euro. So for the euro, originally, as you refer to the Maastricht Treaty, there's always been both the political and the economic argument, and they interact and they move in parallel. Concerning why we are good in blueprints, good in programs, good in plans, but not always in implementation. It's a mixed bag. It's a glass half full, half empty, in my view. There is an axiom that Europe makes best progress when pressed, when in crisis, and there is something into that. For instance, we were able to correct many of the shortcomings and weaknesses of the original construction of the euro in Maastricht in 2010-12, when we created the European Stability Mechanism, economic governance first, European Stability Mechanism, and when ECB started to act as a real lender of last resort and stabilized the markets. So the euro today is quite different from what it used to be after it was created at Maastricht. Now we have the challenge of common defense, and if people are not living in under any illusions, that should prompt action, because it is an existential crisis for Europe, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe, and therefore we must take concrete actions. And I trust that the forthcoming EU summit and the following NATO summit in the end of June will be able to take decisions to this effect. One final point. One reason why the EU is, say, less effective in implementing decisions is simply its nature as a community, as a union of 27 member states, or the euro area as a community of 20, soon 21 member states, as Bulgaria will be joining as of next year. But don't underestimate its capacity to act. If you take common defense, Germany has taken very decisive action in this regard, and in a nation state, in the Federal Republic of Germany, when decisions are taken by the parliament, they will be executed. In Europe, the decisions are often first decisions of principle, and it takes some time before they will be implemented, but yes, they will be implemented in due course.
Thank you very much. So questions, so raise your hand, or either here or virtual. Identify yourselves, please, as well, okay?
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Arnaud, working at the OECD at the Gov department. Just a question on the presentation that you presented. Don't you think that the best way to move Europe forward is to have like a two-speed Europe? It's something that is coming back often in the debates in France. And if not, how can we reach a consensus on the triple tests that you described? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very important question. And I have a view which is, say, a combination of principle and theory, and practice and pragmatism, in the sense that you have to take into account that I'm a former Commission official. I worked for a long time as head of cabinet before I was later on appointed as commissioner and commission vice president. And that's not by accident, because I've always, since my student years, believed in the community method in Europe. And I think the community method, where the Commission proposes, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament take decisions, that's the best and most democratically inclusive way of taking decisions in Europe. And if something is democratically legitimate, then it is resilient and has impact. Having said that, we have to realize that there are pressing issues, there are urgencies, and there are somewhat different and diverging interests also among the member states. And therefore, and that's the pragmatic part of it, therefore it makes sense that on occasion you may use so-called variable geometry, which the EU treaty facilitates, there are rules that facilitate variable geometry so that a smaller number of member states can function as an avant-garde in this regard. And that's why I mentioned in my opening remarks the Bruegel proposal. Bruegel is the, in my view, number one think tank in Brussels these days in economics and economic policy and many other policy analysis issues. And Bruegel's proposal on a European defense mechanism would follow this logic, so that, like the European Stability Mechanism 10 years ago, it could be composed of those EU countries who are ready and able to participate, and it could include non-EU countries as well, who share the same objectives as these countries. And especially when you have a crisis or an urgency. And I come from a country which is in a fairly complicated geopolitical context, lives in a very complicated geopolitical context in the past 1,000 years or so. So we are quite used to be pragmatic, be prepared so that we can show resilience. And that should be the case for Europe as well, so that in the current context, yes, we work through the community instruments, like the SAFE instrument, which has been proposed by the European Commission, 150 billion euros for common European projects in defense investments. But on the side of it, we need more, and we need effective solutions, effective outcomes, and that's why, in my view, this kind of pragmatic variable geometry has its place in the construction of Europe.
Thank you. So we'll take another question here, and then we have another online.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Alberto González from the Economics Department in the OECD. I mean, you have described very well all the geopolitical changes, and one of the impact as well of those changes is that investors are questioning the safety and the soundness of the dollar. And we have seen global portfolios moving away a bit from the dollar. And this also is an opportunity for the euro. So my question was, how do you see these opportunities, and what policies could do to grasp these new opportunities?
Thank you very much. This is an issue which is indeed very much discussed these days among market participants, macroeconomists, and also the general public. And if you look at the current context in this regard, there seems to be increasing lack of confidence as regards not only trade policy but also fiscal policy in the US, with a ballooning deficit following the big beautiful bill of tax cuts. And this has prompted many institutional investors, first hedge funds, now also institutional investors, to consider rebalancing their portfolios. When I discuss with investors, say the typical analysis or typical answer to my question in this regard, the same question I posed to them, is that yes, we are currently overweight in US dollar denominated assets. We will reduce the overweight to more normal levels. We will not go underweight, which basically means that if this takes place broadly among investors in different parts of the world, then even small movements, say 2% or 5% or percentage point movements, can have a significant impact. And these capital flows, they are not going only to the euro-denominated assets, but euro is a significant alternative in this regard. And I have to say that as we are in Paris, you may recall that it was Monsieur le Président Valéry Giscard d'Estaing who, as finance minister in the 60s, coined the expression exorbitant privilege, which the current administration in the US consider as exorbitant burden, which is to be I don't share. As a European, I would actually be quite willing to share some of that exorbitant privilege because it means lower costs on capital, structurally lower interest rates, and therefore, say in structural terms, this is something that as a European, I think we should be working for. What does it mean? Well, in the more medium to long term, I don't expect that the US dollar dominance will collapse or fade away. There may be relative shifts in this regard, and we may be moving from a, say, very unipolar dollar-based global financial system and currency system towards a more multipolar currency system. There are both political forces, geopolitical forces like China and Asia, and say technological forces like cryptos or stablecoins, digitalization in general, which are probably leading towards a more decentralized or fragmented global financial system. And in that context, for Europe, it's important to reinforce the international role of the euro, and that would mean that we would need to have safe liquid assets, which has a link to common defense, as I explained, and we would need to complete the savings and investment union, where we are, with which we would be able to mobilize formidable savings of Europeans towards productive investment. And in general, we have to reform our economies, complete the single market, including digital services, and ensure that our economies are competitive and in good shape. So with these kind of ways and means, we can make Europe more attractive as a destination of investment, and thus rebalance the global monetary system, and also ease the extraordinary burden of the US for having the international reserve currency.
Thank you. I think we have, if I'm not mistaken, difficult for me to read from here, but I think it's the ambassador of Colombia online, Luis Fernando.
Yeah, thank you, Alvaro. And sorry that the video is not active, so I'll have to just be a ghost in the room. Thank you, Governor Rehn. You've given us a whole buffet of food for thought. And I was not planning to ask this question because I thought, but you spoke with very cross-disciplinary breadth. So this is not the kind of question I would ask to a governor, but still you spoke about the common European defense. And I think that, okay, there are many questions right now emerging about that. I can, first of all, from the Latin American point of view, I know that the European Union has voiced its openness to sharing part of the technological innovations and investment that will come with that from with Latin America, and I think that's great, and I'm really enthusiastic about that prospect. And I agree that, yeah, defense, a common defense mechanism done right can have many benefits, not only for defense itself, but also for productivity, even for investment in other areas. And, you know, you mentioned that your first dissertation was on corporatism, and I think that defense has a corporatist nature, which probably would be a good thing to bring in a little bit in Europe nowadays. But then there are pitfalls as well. And I wonder, I mean, first of all, the threat perception is different in Europe. Of course, you're from Finland, which has a very acute perception of threat. So, but then I wonder if that sense of threat is perceived in the same way across all the continent, and whether that might actually create some fractures in the sense of purpose about this defense mechanism. And second, I mean, how do you avoid this defense mechanism from turning into kind of a garrison state that will privilege a lot of investments that will just be, build up a military might that doesn't generate welfare and therefore doesn't generate legitimacy in the same way. So I'm really of two minds about this emerging view in Europe about the urgency for a defense mechanism. I can see many good things of it, but I also wonder, I can also see the risks, and so how to navigate them, both politically speaking and socially speaking, the risks of this drive for defense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your very important question. And first, I want to say that I see that there is a very large untapped potential in European, Latin American economic and other relations, and we should together work in order to mobilize that potential and make good use of it. And as you referred to corporatism, I can confess to you that I have also some past in studying corporatism in Latin America, as my former fiancée at Oxford wrote her thesis on el corporativismo in Mexico, concerning PRI and its role at the time. And I was very closely a kind of an associate member of the Latin American student community at Oxford at the time. Lázaro Cárdenas and all that corporatism which Mexico for a very long time has portrayed. Anyway, you had a very critical question concerning the garrison state and the nature of the reaction in different parts of Europe. I was recently in Madrid and Sevilla, at the University of Sevilla, giving a talk, and I sensed that even though Spain is a bit further away from eastern parts of Europe, but there is still understanding that we have in different times expressed solidarity across countries in Europe, including during the Eurozone debt crisis, when many countries had to support with very major political difficulties, support countries that had difficulties. And we have our regional development funds, we have our cohesion funds. So I think there is overall a fairly good understanding, nevertheless, across Europe, including in Spain, of the need to ensure that we also have a sufficiently strong defense of Europe, common defense of Europe. Concerning the garrison state, if you look at the spending levels on defense during the Cold War, they used to be, if I say off the cuff, they used to be somewhere above 5% normally in Europe. Now we are talking about an increase from 1.5% to 2% to 3.5%. And democracy in Europe is very strongly embedded. So I don't actually see that we would have such a danger, because all the investments in defense and defense industries are in the hands of democratically elected politicians, both in the EU member states and at the European Council, which leads the way, or the European Commission, which leads the way in these kind of decisions in Europe.
Thank you. We have Carmine, and then we have the Ambassador of Poland, and the Ambassador Stoni too.
Governor, thank you. Apologies for not being here, so I came late, but we have meetings of directors, as Alvaro knows, so I have a justification actually on data and things. Now, you mentioned SIU in one of the comments, and now, first question is that, okay, we have been also at the OECD, but also in previous capacities working on these issues for many years. Why this time it should work with respect also to capital markets union? Because, everyone talks about it, everyone is happy, but then I happen also to be in some of the meeting, and I guess also in the past, and then when you go in a meeting of the I mean, the council, then really member states, no one wants, especially some of them. First. Second, I mean, you are the governor of Finland. You have seen the experience of the single supervisory mechanism. So for banking supervision, we went after a crisis. So with the emergence of a crisis, we went to a more central, supervisory system. And it's so important and so good for Euro countries. Now we have the case of Bulgaria that you experienced in Finland, the Nordea moving the legal seat from Sweden to be in the supervisory mechanism. So the value of having some more centralized supervision is important. Do you think that we should evolve also in the capital markets area to a more, let's say, I wouldn't say centralized system, but a more federal system? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the answer is yes. I think we should move towards and you were it right, to a more integrated or federal system, which of course you have to look at details because devil is in the details, but this kind of a more unified system would be necessary in order to create a genuine savings and investment union, which is say a developed concept from the capital markets union. And as you referred to the question of why this time we should be expecting more progress, I've seen this discussion over the past 10 years, and no doubt some time ago, some years ago, I was quite frustrated because we didn't see too much progress in this regard. The Commission made its first proposal sometime in 2015 or so. It was discussed previously, but with a different, under different concept. But more recently, in the course of last year and this year, this objective of the Savings and Investment Union has gained new importance, and there has been much more serious discussions in the Council and Parliament in order to make good progress in this regard. But I would encourage the Commission really, as I said in my opening remarks, to set a deadline, to set a timeline for that, as François Villeroy of Bank of France has proposed, a bit like the Delors Commission set the deadline of 1992 for the completion of the single market, or for the euro, which was created with a similar method, very precise three-step timeline in the course of the 1990s. Then you get spine. You have good backbone for the and discipline for the progress, and I would very much encourage the European Commission to act to this direction. Moreover, it would make sense in this field to have a so-called 28th regime, which would be a European legal regime where the companies could opt in as an alternative, which would then speed up progress towards a genuine capital markets union. On the banking union, just briefly, you're right that Nordea decided some 6-7 years ago to move its headquarters and balance sheet from Stockholm to Helsinki. And one, if not the key motivation, was they wanted to be in the euro area. They wanted to be under the supervision of the banking union or single supervisory mechanism of the ECB. Maybe they have some business ideas about being more active in the euro area in the future. I don't know, that's their business, but this is what happened, and I'm glad that they took this move. Now they are, like all the systemically important large banks in Europe, supervised by the single supervisory mechanism, and the SSM has now celebrated its 10th anniversary last year. It's been now in operation for 11 years or so, and I think many of the teething problems have been overcome. But we are aware at the ECB that things may be improved, and that's why we set up some time ago a simplification task force of 5 or 6 governors, and I'm a member of this task force. We try to look at how things can be simplified in regulation, banking regulation and supervision, but not throw the baby with the bathwater, which is the capital buffers, the level of the capital buffers, which have given us resilience in different moments of market turbulence. In the first years of SSM, the banks often complained that the SSM in its supervision is intrusive. Well, when I heard this, I said, well, that sounds good. It has to be intrusive. Now, more recently, this kind of criticism has been less general, less prevalent, but I trust that SSM still is doing intrusive work in banking supervision. That's to the benefit of the Europeans.
Thank you, Alvaro. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Alvaro. Hello, Olli. It's been a long time. Thank you for your talk. I was very impressed by, or rather heartened by, the fact that there are people in Frankfurt who are taking such a wide view of these, this trifecta of crises that are affecting the world and therefore affecting Europe. One could mention a few more. I think the crisis of democracy in the United States seems to be becoming more and more worrying. There was very little one could disagree with, and so I won't disagree, but I have 2 questions regarding growth and your views on that, and 1 question regarding defense and a comment regarding defense, and a little bit relating to the euro, to the change in the euro that you described, to the fundamental, in a sense, change in the nature of the euro that you described, and the Eurozone crisis that we both lived through, and in a way its relation to the crisis, to the defense crisis that we're facing now. So to start off with the questions regarding growth, the larger question is that you, as many other people, put an enormous amount of stress on the development of the single, what used to be called the Capital Markets Union, and is now called the Savings and Investment Union. And the implicit suggestion here, although it's not stated straight out, and maybe it's simply that this is what's on the agenda and one would move on to other stuff later, is that this is the critical element that's holding back European growth. Whereas traditionally, we always used to think it was product markets, it was labor markets. And my question to you is, do you really, you may be right, I mean, that may be right, but do we really think that those labor and product market decisions, which in a way are harder to deal with than the capital market ones, have largely been solved? Or is it simply that that's where we can move ahead, and that's where we're therefore moving ahead? It fits into a narrative that we get from the United States that American exceptionalism has been thanks to the deep development of American capital markets. But what may or may not be true in America need not necessarily be the key problem in Europe. So that's the first question. The second question relates to it a bit. You mentioned the Letta report, and you mentioned, no, you didn't mention, but in the Letta report, there is something that Christine has mentioned, Christine Lagarde has mentioned, and that is the supposed existence of non-tariff barriers within Europe, amounting to something like the equivalent of 40% tariffs on goods and 100% tariffs on services. I've spent several months trying to get to the source of this opinion. It was originally published in an IMF paper. We've written to the IMF. Silence. So I would like to know, what are these barriers, these 40% barriers to trade in goods and 100% barriers in trade in services? I mean, it's obvious it's going to be hard to plead in front of a Polish court in Dutch. And if that's one of those barriers, then, you know, we'll have to learn to live with it, but maybe not. In other words, to what extent do we have an idea of how removable these barriers are and how simply unavoidable they are? That's my second question on growth. My question on defense is on the defense mechanism. Because while being in the creation of the EFSF, as you may remember, we both were, and then its development into the ESM, and it's much better as the ESM than it was as the EFSF. The question is, would this defense mechanism simply be a financing mechanism, or would it, in the sense that it would, financing in the sense that it would gather resources and hand them out to states, or would it actually finance projects? Because my fear is that if it's the first, the money will be divided up largely politically. And my intuition is that what we actually need is something that can allocate the money on a best use basis, and therefore something, I mean, whether it's called a mechanism or called a bank is after all secondary, but something which would have a core of truly independent professionals who know the defense industry and are able to actually say, well, we'll lend to this and we won't lend to that. So my question is, do you agree that we need something like that, whatever we might decide to call it? And my comment is a political one, and this is really the only, out of all, you know, you've spoken a lot, and there was practically nothing I could disagree with in what you said, except in a sense in the implication of what you said towards the very end, when you said, well, in response to the Colombian ambassador, Europe has this solidarity because the countries that were in a fiscally strong position did help during the Eurozone crisis. And of course, that change was one that, and then that led to the change in the euro, which has made the euro stronger as well. Well, you know, frankly, the way I remember it, and I think the way you remember it, is that that help and that support came a whole year too late. And to be quite frank, saying, well, it was terribly difficult politically to do this in countries like, you know, fiscally very conservative countries. Yes, but, you know, it came at least a year too late with a huge amount of difficulty, to put it mildly. My feeling is that it's the time, and now it's paradoxically those countries that then did help, but helped late, are actually the ones that are in the first line, on the front line. I think it's actually time to say, we were remiss then. We should have shown quicker and greater solidarity and greater empathy, and now we're asking for your help. And that, in a sense, is my first point, but it relates then to a practical point. And that is that we actually, you know, the defense spending target will be raised to 3.5%, but 3.5% is not going to be enough immediately, even if it were applied by everybody, because there are such backlogs that it will take time for that to happen. And not all, even if Germany expands its military expenditure very considerably, it just won't be able to, for logistical, organizational reasons, to reach the kind of level of defense that it would need. It seems to me that this is also a moment for those who are rich and more threatened to say, we will help those who are further back, therefore safer, but in a financially weaker position, to expand their military expenditure so as to make us all safer. And, you know, this would seem to be, I know this is, I'm stretching what's politically feasible, but this is actually, and I'll use a word which would be taboo, and one would have to invent a different one or invent some sort of mechanism. which would actually not just spend money on procurement, because we've talked about that, the EMS, but also on actual defense budgets. We need something along the lines of what would be defense Eurobonds, even if we call it something different, at least for the 5 years of what I would now call a window of peril, right? Whilst we're making up for the sins of the past, the failure to spend more than 1.1% of GDP on defense. And I shan't mention the country concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacek, for very important questions. And I recall our times together at the Ecofin Council when, for instance, we were creating the European Financial Stability Mechanism facility in the dramatic weekend of the 7th to 10th of May. That was Schuman Day, Europe Day, which went until Monday, the 10th of May in Brussels. But we made it, and then we corrected it to the permanent ESM, as you know. Very difficult questions, but I try to be concise and tackle them one by one. So first, concerning growth, you are right, certainly, that concerning the product market, we have not fully completed our work in the single market. And I have to say that I'm not in detail familiar with the numbers that have been expressed by the ECB side, but my understanding is that they indeed refer to legal barriers and other kind of non-tariff barriers, cultural barriers, which may be a bit more difficult to quantify. Concerning the labor market, the picture is quite different compared to 10 years or 20 years ago, in a sense that while we suffered for long over too high unemployment in Europe, for the moment, employment levels are actually record low, at least compared to the past 40 years, 30, 40 years. Latest unemployment level in unemployment figure in Europe is slightly above 6% in the Eurozone. So things have changed in many ways. Of course, demographics play a role, immigration plays a role. Also, labor market reforms in many countries do play a role and have had impact. That is not to say that things would be perfect, and we have to look at the new challenges with the AI and its impact on the working life, all the productivity challenges. But this may explain why there is more focus on the capital market, which is one of the stumbling blocks of better growth. Concerning the defense mechanism, I fully agree with you that it should not only be handouts, it should be financing common projects, and its say conditionality or criteria should be constructed so that it incentivizes member states to work together with a coordinated manner to enhance defense industries, so that we would get better quality and higher volume, and not only higher prices, which otherwise might be the case. And this, by the way, there's one dilemma which is important, which has not been, to my mind, solved yet, and that relates to what you said. We don't have in the European Union for the moment an effective strategic planning structure that could do this coordination. There is one in NATO, and then the critical question is, can the EU use the NATO structure, or should it create its own? Because without such a planning and coordination structure, you don't get to your objective, but you have a fragmented system. Whether it is called defense mechanism or defense development bank, that is secondary, but this should be the way it should be constructed. As regards the political question you posed towards the end on the solidarity, yes, we have to have realism in this regard. concerning the past, I have to say that, as you said, we were a whole year too late. If you think of late 2009, 2010, the Eurozone debt crisis was actually triggered quite suddenly. I worked as an enlargement commissioner until February 2010. I was supposed to start as Economic and Monetary Affairs Commissioner in 1st of November 2009. The Greek crisis started with the new deficit numbers in October 2009, when instead of 3%, the deficit was estimated to be 6%. Thanks to the European Parliament, we got confirmation so that we could start in February 2010. And at that point, neither the member states like Germany or other member states or the Greek government were ready to request conditional financial assistance. So the Commission's task was to work to both directions to convince Prime Minister Papandreou and his government and convince Chancellor Merkel, Finance Minister Schäuble and other member states that we have to act now because we didn't have any chips, we didn't have any instrument. And it took us beyond land elections in Germany in May 2010, and it took us beyond quite some dramatic moments in Greece before Greece, first of all, accepted that it needs financial assistance, and the other member states accepted that they have to do it. I think still we did it relatively quickly. I know how hard it was for many citizens in Europe, and I agree with you that Europe should have acted early on. But thanks to the structure that we have, it was in those circumstances not possible. One final point, I agree with you on the defense Eurobonds. So that's one essential element of the future construction.
Well, we almost ran out of time, but I know that I have there's another question there. And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you, Alvaro. Priit Palm, Ambassador of Estonia. Thank you, Governor Rehn, for your insightful views. I have two questions under the auspices of, as long as we live in sovereign states and operate in sovereign states, think globally, act locally. And one is from this first part of your presentation, the question, yeah, we sort things out, get price stability in Europe, then we get growth. But we acknowledged already a decade ago in Europe that yes, but most of the global growth is happening outside Europe, and that same applies to technology. So what's your answer to that? Is the relative size of Europe shrinking globally, and how we can cope with the globalization? And then the other is within the micro world of Europe. As a neighboring state, we know very well in Estonia that Finland is one of the best welfare states in Europe, if not in the world, both in the European world. And as a European, there is still this expression, the country I know best. In your view, what are the three ingredients of Finnish welfare state over the last couple of decades that you can share with us here? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these two questions. First, concerning Europe's role in the world, you are fully right, and just for the sake of keeping my opening remarks reasonably concise, I didn't go into the wider issues of Europe's global role, but I think it's clear that we are living in an Asian century, and always when I visit Asia, different parts of Asia, be it Japan, be it China, be it some of the ASEAN countries, be it India, so I see that that really is the region where there is entrepreneurial dynamism in the economy, and you can see that that region is growing very fast. And from the European point of view, it's important that we adjust to this new world, which is very different from how the world looked like in 2000 or 1975 or 1950. Our relative share is smaller. It doesn't have to make us say less prosperous or less happy or less satisfied with life. And we have to defend and maintain our European model of democracy, rule of law, and social market economy. At the same time, we have to realize that some other parts of the world are developing faster and growing faster. To my mind, it means that every EU member state actually is a small state in a global context, including even the largest one. Germany, with its 84 million citizens, 84 million people, is about 1% of world population. The only difference is that we have in Europe those countries that have realized that they are small states and those countries that have not yet realized that they are small states. And the implication to my mind is that we have to be united and we have to work on that basis to succeed in this wider world. You made a tough question concerning Finland and the country I know best, as we normally say, and what are the three ingredients. I was just the other day at the meeting of the Economic Council of Finland, which is chaired by the Prime Minister and includes the social partners and entrepreneurial associations and some other. And I was fairly critical about self-critical about our current situation, because we have a serious problem of public debt in Finland. So I'm not idolizing or idealizing Finland by no means. But if you look at the longer term growth from being a very poor country, underdeveloped country in the late 19th century, still in the early 20th century, the relative success story of Finland is based on a number of factors. One is sound foreign and security policy, which has navigated through very difficult periods of the 20th century and the present century. Second is education, expansion of education in the early part of the 20th century and again after the Second World War. My mother was the first university student of her extended family. My father didn't complete primary school. That's why he wanted that I would try to study and do my doctoral thesis. So very strong educational ethos. And I see, when I look at many Asian countries, I see the same kind of ethos there. And the third element is trust in the society, trust in the democratic institutions, trust in the rule of law. And that is very fundamental also, which facilitates also social and economic progress of any country, and facilitates also resilience and preparedness in this world of power politics, world of geopolitics. And we are, of course, a happy and proud member of the European Union, and I shouldn't forget to mention that being part of the West and the European Union has been critical in this regard. I might end actually in this regard by referring to my grandfather, maternal grandfather, who was born in 1912. He didn't go to he did primary school. He got training as a mason from the age of 12 onwards. Worked as a taxi driver and taxi entrepreneur, as a constructor of small houses, among other things. Served 5 years in the war, in the Winter War and in the Continuation War. Came back from there as a reserve sergeant. On the day of the referendum of Finland Finnish referendum of the European Union, joining the European Union in October 1994. I called him from my home Helsinki to my hometown in Mikkeli, Eastern Finland, and we were good friends with him, and he was then whatever 80 something, and I asked him, so Grandpa, have you already voted? Sunday, have you already voted? And if so, what are you planning to vote? Because I was active in the European movement. So his response was quick, immediate, and concise. He said, "Of course, I voted. I voted yes. I looked 5 years only to the east. Since then, I have only been looking to the west." And that's our philosophy in the tropics of Finland.
Well, with that, I could see the breadth and the strategic thought of Governor Rehn. I think was an excellent lecture. So let's give him a big round of applause. And we'll announce the next lecture, Governor, soon. But meanwhile, I just want to wish you a great day and great weekend. And I think you left us a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much once again. Thank you.